Por exemplo, temos ali comparado isto com vinhos de que idade? Acho que é interessante. Há vinhos que estão há 40 anos.
Sim, isto podia ser real. Sorry, you're live?
Yeah, you're live.
Okay. Hi, good evening everybody. I hope you can hear me. I'm here with Ricardo and we're going to be talking to you this evening about a style of port that is actually not very well known but offers terrific value. Crusted Port. And Ricardo and I have actually selected, we've got 3 bottlings of our Crusted Port here to show you and to show how the different ports have evolved. So we've got the oldest port, which is the 2000 bottling. We have the 2007, and then we have the 2014. Okay? As I said, Crusted Port is a style that is not very well known, but offers great value. Its origins actually are British and date back to the days when vintage port used to be shipped in barrel, in cask, to wine merchants in the UK. And so they would receive 50 or 100 pipes of a particular vintage port in barrel. And it's funny, as a trade, we used to talk about what we call lodge pipes, which are 550 litres, and then shipping pipes, which are 535 litres. And the difference was basically the amount of sediment that the buyer would have to suffer. So when a wine merchant was buying port from us or from a port shipper, we'd often sell the port as a shipping pipe, so 535 litres, even though it actually measured 550. And what would happen is that they would then, the barrels would be received by whichever company it was in London or in Bristol or wherever, and they would let the cask settle so that the sediment would settle, and then they would bottle the vintage port free of sediment, okay? And what would happen is that each barrel would then have a leftover of maybe 10, 15, 20 litres of sediment, which at the end of the vintage bottling, those merchants would mix that together, would join that, and would leave it, and they'd leave it for a number of months in cask. Now, they would have bottled the vintage port by then, and that port then didn't have a vintage name, and so they came up with a name which was called Crusted Port. Now, when they first bottled it, it was actually known as Crusting Port, and you will see there are a lot of merchants who would still be selling Crusting Port, which is a young crusted port that hadn't yet thrown the sediment. Okay. Now, the value for money aspect of Crusted Port is that it's basically produced from vintage quality ports, okay? But the theory is that the whole essence is for it to actually throw a sediment in bottle and what, as we call it in the trade, open up quicker than the vintage port. When we're bottling vintage ports, we tend to keep the vintage port usually in large oak vats, so there's very little air. And when we bottle a vintage port, the sediment is thrown gradually over a period of 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years. With a crusted port, as it's been aged in barrel, in cask, there's a certain micro-oxygenation which, when that port is bottled in bottle, it throws the sediment very quickly, and that's really the objective, because what we want is for it to open up and develop like a mature vintage port. Okay, so the origins go back to these British merchants who would buy vintage port, and then basically they would keep the remains, the rest of the port that they didn't bottle in cask, And then finally they would bottle it as crusting port, which eventually would become crusted port. Okay, and in those days it would be sold normally with the merchant's name, okay, the British merchant's name, and it would be sold with the bottling date, not the vintage date. Okay. Now, when vintage port, let's say when the Portuguese government stopped port shippers from actually selling vintage port in bulk, and when it had to be bottled here, obviously that came to an end. And what we did at Churchill's was to carry on the same principle. And what we used to do was, even in the 80s, we were still allowed to ship port in bulk in those days, even though it wasn't vintage port. And we'd ship it over to London and have it bottled. So our original Churchill's crusted ports, I think the first one was 1984, 85, 86, etc. Those are the bottling dates. Were all bottled in London, okay? We would ship them over in bulk. There came a point then when shipments of bulk port became illegal, and so everything had to be bottled here in Portugal. So at that stage, the Port Wine Institute recognised Crusted as a port brand, because up to that stage it wasn't a recognised port brand here in the Institute. It was a brand that was introduced by importers and by wine merchants in the UK. But once it was, once let's say the brand had been registered with the Port Wine Institute, we started to bottle crusted port here in Portugal. And we follow the same principle in that the crusted port at Churchill's that we bottle is all ports that come from vintage reserves. So they're vintage quality ports of different years. In our case, we tend to do a blend of 2 years before the bottling. So when we talk about a 2000 bottling, this is crusted port bottled 2000. It would have been the vintage reserves of 1998 and 1999, which were blended. We then give them age in cask in order so that once they bottle, they precipitate quickly. And that's the formula that we followed. And what we're showing you today is the 2000, the 2007 and the 2014 to show you the evolution of crusted port. Being a quality of vintage, obviously it has the potential to age very well. I mean, in our recommendations, we suggest that crusted port should be aged for at least 5 years, between 5 and 10. But because on the whole, certainly Churchill's, we make ports to last, crusted port will last a lot longer than the 10 years. And in fact, we have a very good example here, which is the 2000 bottling, which is now 20 years old. And we'll start with tasting that, okay?
Yeah.
Ricardo.
I think the nice thing about being able to select wines from vintage quality ports is that, as you said, they're meant to age, and by combining two different vintages, sometimes we get the best out of it. And so at the end, we're looking at wines that offer real complexity and texture, and you know, and they really have a lovely aging potential. And I think being crusted, sometimes very unknown for most of the common public, it is a wine that really offers value for money because the quality is amazing, and we've been tasting these wines for quite some time, and we've been really knowing that they age lovely in the bottle. And so when we're going to taste the Crusted 2000, we're combining a little bit of wines from 1998, and also it's actually a wine that it's special because it has the first wines from when we bought Grisha in 1999.
Pinto the Grisha, yeah.
And at the end they combine very well and offer a wine with, for sure, they meant to be aged in an earlier stage than a vintage port. I think that's a little bit the goal by putting in cask. But it's difficult to assess the end of the aging potential because they tend to keep on growing in bottle for a long time.
And it's amazing, like I always say, you know, it's very rare that ports get over the hill, as we call it. I've drank very few vintage ports in my time that really have been over the hill. I mean, it's amazing how vintage ports will go on enduring, you know, they will go on aging and they will last. And crusted port, being made from vintage port stocks, has the same endurance qualities. And so when you taste this 2000, I hope you agree. It's got the idea of crusted port is really to show the bottle age that a vintage port has, and really to demonstrate that softness but richness that you get and concentration that you get from aging a vintage port. And I think that's what you'll see when you taste this. You've got that bottle age flavour, which is so appealing.
Yeah, and it softens down a little bit the tannic structure, so it's like fast pouring to a mature vintage port. It will lose a little bit of the color, it will lose the tannins, but then it will has a real gain in complexity and also in flavor. It offers a really nice wine to drink because it's really soft and it has a long taste at the end. So I think it's
we often call crusted really the port levels port, because it doesn't have, let's say, it doesn't have the investment potential of an iconic vintage, but yet it's made from pretty much the same quality grape. So it offers terrific value at a tenth of the price, or certainly when it's mature. Okay.
Moving on to kind of food pairings, what would you suggest pairs well with a crusted?
Well, it follows a little bit the same principle as a mature vintage port. So you're looking really at drinking this as an after dinner or an after lunch drink. It'll go very well, obviously, with cheese. Either a hard cheese, whether it's cheddar cheese or Stilton or blue cheese, or even a soft cheese, whether it's something like brie or camembert. It's delicious. Apart from that, I think it goes well with also some of the rather like vintage port, mature vintage port. It goes well with apple and almond-based desserts. As it gets older, it's quite delicate, a crusted port. So, whereas sometimes with a younger vintage port, you say drink it with a creme brulee or with a chocolate mousse, I think crusted needs a little bit more delicacy, certainly as it gets older.
Yeah, because it is a bit more delicate, because it acts like an old vintage port. So at the end, you don't want to combine it with very strong food, otherwise it will tend to dominate this elegant character of a crusted, especially the first two that have already 20 years in bottle and 13 years in bottle. So I think, it is a lovely wine. It needs to be decanted because it will throw a sediment. So at the end, it's important to decant it with a couple of hours in advance. But I think at the end, it's a lovely wine to drink either on its own. I always like to drink port on its own, but it goes lovely with cheese and also with a bit of those apple pies and those kind of things.
I always say decant if you can. Decanting means you get more out of the wine. At the end of the day, if you decant, you actually maximise the quantity of liquid that you will get. But if you decide at the last minute to get a bottle of crusted out of the cellar, stand it up as long as you can, and then pour it gently in one go, keep it. Pour 6 or if there are 4 or 5 of you, pour the 5 glasses all together in one go, so that you don't get the sediment that's being stirred up. Okay.
We've got a question which has come in from Burnett and Herbert, so it's our good friend Ed Burnett. Will crusted ports age for as long as vintage ports, or drink them while you're waiting for the vintage port to be ready?
Yeah, obviously it's. I think they won't age as long as a classic vintage port. Basically, because we've encouraged this port, we've actually aged it in cask. We've given it a bit of oxygenation so that it actually throws a sediment more quickly. And so the whole purpose of this is to actually bring forward the bottle aging process. So you're right, it won't age. It's not a port that you're going to age for 40 or 50 years. You're drinking one that's been aged for 20 years and it still tastes jolly good. But that's really. I would say you'd probably age it for another 10,
Yeah,
20 years, maybe
I
10, at least 30 years. Possibly.
the idea is to fast forward the window of opportunity to the maximum potential to drink this wine. So I think it won't go the full marathon as a vintage port, but if you start to drink it at an earlier stage, you can drink it before a mature vintage port. But we're talking about 2000. Let's move on to the 2007. Well, 2007 represents a blend of vintage port reserves from 2005 and 6. It's two interesting years. 2005, I think, it was quite elegant in terms of the wines produced from the harvest, while 2006 was a bit more of a hot year. Do you remember well about this? So at the end, I think when you taste wine, it has maturity, but then it has a line of freshness that keeps the wine really, really alive. And I think when you taste this wine before, it's still growing. That's the interesting part of a Crusted, don't you think?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I was just thinking, Crusteds were introduced really in the days when, we now have late bottle vintages which are matured in bottle as well. But in the early days, there was just vintage port and premium ruby, and very little in between. And so Crusted Port very much filled the gap. Nowadays, it still fills that gap because a lot of the LBVs, late bottle vintages, are actually filtered before bottling, so they're very similar to the old-fashioned premium ruby.
Yeah, but now that you have much more categories on the port business, at the end, Crusted tends to be a wine perfect for connoisseurs because, even if it's not said on the bottle, we're working with vintage quality wines. So that's why, at the end, even we're fast forwarding the aging process by putting in cask prior to bottling, we're talking about raw material that's really, really good quality. So at the end, they're lovely wines to age, and that's why they're unfiltered and we use a natural cork, driven cork.
Driven cork, yeah.
And that's why at the end, it's difficult to assess a deadline for drinking these wines because they tend to age really well. And so at the end, we think they can be enjoyed after 5 years of the bottle, but it's at the end, it's really difficult to find a final date.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's move on to the 14, which
14
is still showing. This is now 6 years old, isn't it? So
yeah,
in bottle, 6 years in bottle. Don't forget with Crusted, it's bottling.
Bottling date, yeah.
Yeah, what figures always is the bottling date. So you have Crusted Port bottled in 2000, and here we have Crusted Port. Churchill's Crusted Port bottled in 2014, and it's the bottling date that's important for Crusted because it then tells you how long it's been aged in bottle. Okay, so this has been aged in bottle for 6 years. As you'll see, it's still quite full-bodied. It's thrown a certain amount of sediment. It's quite interesting, when you decant bottles of Crusted Port, they tend to have much more sediment in the bottle than if you decant a vintage port. And it's very much the fact that we've given this aging in cask.
The oxygen, yeah.
The micro-oxygenation really does means it throws sediment. And it's noticeable when you decant a bottle, you have a lot of crust in it. And so, but the 2014 is still very young.
Yeah, it's still quite close and young and vibrant. And the interesting thing, for example, in these 3 Crusted Ports we're tasting, we're actually talking about Crusted Ports that haven't been from any vintage year. So 2000, we're talking about wines from 1998 and 1999, and 2007, we're talking about wines from 05 and 06, and 14, we're talking about wines from 12 and 13.
Yeah. That might be complicated for people. Let me just explain, because you have what we call declared vintage years, like 2000, 2003, 2007, 2011. But every year we reserve vintage quality ports for a potential vintage. Okay, so even in non-vintage declared years, there will be an element of vintage port reserves, and so that's what Ricardo was talking about.
We're always able to select small amounts of wines that have a vintage quality potential, even if at the end we don't declare it as a vintage year. And that's what we try to do with the Crusted Ports. we select these top wines from each harvest, and we select them, and then that's when we're going to blend it in 2 consecutive vintages and bottle it as a Crusted Port.
I've got a quick question from Alex Bridgman. Is the blend of vintages, e.g. the 2005 and 2006, about 50% each? So is the blend of the vintages for each year about 50%?
About, but it's not. There's no hard and fast rule. We will tend to refresh the older one with a little bit of the younger one. That's what usually happens there. But
Yeah, it's always a question of tasting and blending. It's never a determined rule that you say it's 50% of each. No, it depends. But normally it's a refreshment from the young port into the older one. Okay. Yeah, this 2014 is quite young and quite intense. So I think.
But very well balanced.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
It has grip,
yeah.
and you know.
And I think you should see a style that runs through them. You know, all 3 of these ports, there's a similar style here that runs through them, this Churchill style, which it's rich, fruity, but slightly on the drier side.
Yeah, and they all, you know, you'll see that 2014 is much more full-bodied because it's younger, it's normal blended. There's a common ground of acidity that keeps the wines really fresh, and that's, for us, that's, you know, it's not just about the crust, it's about all the wines we produce. We're always looking for the dry style and that natural acidity that keeps the wine, you know, vibrant and alive. So I think they do represent very well our style of ports.
Great. Well, we've got a question coming in from Jenna Graham. Are wine merchants in the UK still interested in Crusted Port?
Well, Jenna, hi there. Yeah, I think yes is the answer. I think, you know, it's a fluctuating situation. I think there's a renewed interest in crusted because, as I say, I think, you know, a lot of people don't know very much about Crusted Port, and it intrigues people. And so, and as we've said here, it offers great value for money. So, you know, I think it's very much a hand sell. You know, a customer, they're going to have to, let's say, explain to their customers what crusted is, and that's important. But I think it offers, Crusted Port offers, you know, a different avenue, which differs from the usual, you know, whether it's the reserves or the premium rubies or even the LBVs. This offers you know, a different you know, a different style on a very good quality port.
Yeah, nowadays there's always a growing interest for different things, and crusted really is an uncommon and not so well known style of port. But I think at the end, when people get to know and to learn a little bit more about crusted ports and this style of crusted ports, they do realize that they're facing with a wine that it's really, you know, top quality. So at the end, for those that don't know, I think it might well be an interesting wine to try out.
We got another question from Wine Talk Group asking, where in the US can I find Crusted Port?
Where in the US can you find? Well, I mean, it is stocked by a number of liquor stores. Off the top of my head, it's difficult to say where. Depends whether it's in New York or whether it's in Chicago. But there will be liquor stores that will be stocking of Crusted Port. As far as Churchill's, we're in a stage where we're changing from importers, and so I'm still not. I can't necessarily give you. It's information that we can actually send you.
Yeah,
of course.
If they can send a PM, we can then.
And on our website, you can find a list of the stockists which have stocked our ports in the past. So if you have a look on our website, you can find that there. Okay. Great. Well, that's all the questions for the English session. We'll be coming back to you live in about 5 minutes for the Portuguese version.
Okay. And please, if you'd like to stay, see how good your Portuguese is. Please stay. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.